Hey, it's Mike. Thanks for tuning back in. Today's Friday, which means it is Attic Find Friday, which is always the best day of the week. This one is fun. It's perfect. It's right up my alley because it is Babe Ruth, it's vintage, and it's autographs. Great story to go along with it. But I ask, is any of it real? We'll get into that a little bit. And I want to know in comments, what's your opinion of all of this? First of all, Attic Find Friday is now sponsored by Iron Guard Supplies. For all your sports card supplies needs, go to ironguardsupplies.com. Enter in the code JUNKWAX20, that's JUNKWAX20, to get 20% off your order. I'll put the link and the code in the description of this video for you to click through and place an order for supplies. 20% off, can't beat that. So Brian Drent of Mile High Cards tells this story, and this actually comes to us from a subscriber. Last week, I think it was, I talked in Attic Find Friday about how I had seen, and I've mentioned this a couple times now, and when I was at the Shriner Show in Massachusetts, I saw Babe Ruth autographed Goudey cards, 1933, that on the label said that they came from the Mile High Find collection. And I have done a ton of searching on Google, haven't been able to find anything. One of you sent me an email with 3 links that gave me the details of this find. The interesting thing is that none of the labels actually say that, so they must have been resubmitted to PSA to get that on the label. I'm not really sure. I couldn't find that out, interestingly, but this has to be the story. And so either way, it's a great story, so I'm going to go with it. Brian Drent, Mile High Cards, owns Mile High Cards Auction House, has for 27 years or so. Tells the story. In 2019, he had become aware of a scrapbook loaded with Babe Ruth items that had some autographs in it, some Babe Ruth autographs in it, and he spent months trying to procure it, trying to buy it from the owner. The owner was a man in his 80s who's still alive, who had inherited this from his father, who had been a collector in the 1920s and 1930s. The man in his 80s who owned this, his family was working through an intermediary, and this is the story. I want to know what parts of this what parts of this are you skeptical about? Because there's a lot. I read through a long thread on blowout forums. There's a lot of skepticism about this, and I tend to believe these things. I think that the most simple solution is usually the best, and the most simple solution is usually that it's real and that we're stretching to find anything to be skeptical about, but there are a lot of red flags about this. We'll go through them, and just let me know in comments what you think. So Brian Drent had spent a long time trying to buy this from the intermediary, and he made an offer for it. I don't know how much the offer was or how much he paid for it. I do have the amounts that he sold these cards for. We'll get to that at the end. And the family had a young man in his 20s negotiating hard, trying to get more than double what the collection was really worth. The intermediary ultimately convinced this young man that it was unreasonable to ask for that much, and that Brian Drent's offer was good. So he ended up buying it. Brian Drent flew into Philadelphia and then rented a car, drove 90 minutes to pick up the scrapbook. Well, I've got pictures of the scrapbook too. And drove 90 minutes into the country, into the mountains of Pennsylvania to get this from the intermediary. Never met the family, never spoke with the family or the collector. And that's one of the red flags, and I don't think it's a red flag, but it's one of those things that the people in the forums, and there's also a forum on Net54 where they talk about this. Now, these sellers oftentimes want to be anonymous. They don't want the IRS after them. They don't want family knowing that they've just suddenly come into a lot of money. There could be a lot of reasons that a family stays anonymous. But that's one thing. In the last few days of this purchase, the price more than doubled. And Brian Drent says it more than doubled because PSA graded the cards and the autographs right at the end. So there's something interesting, because then in a separate article, PSA says that and I might have some slight details wrong here, but PSA says that they were brought presumably by Brian Durant to the National, where PSA graded them on site in 2019. But did the intermediary take them to the National in 2019 and then sell them to Brian Durant? That doesn't add up, nor does it add up that PSA would have already graded them for the intermediary and then PSA graded them on site at the National. It's a little confusing, I will say, and that's red flag number 2. That's something very odd about this story. But anyway, so Brian Durant's story goes that he showed up, the price had doubled because PSA had authenticated everything. They had now had 14-ish autographs of Babe Ruth that were authenticated also by JSA, which is, I don't know, there are a lot of I've read a ton of things about this story. I looked at tweets, I looked at articles on PSA, I read through everything that Brian Durant said. It's interesting to say the least. And I'm not saying that this is wrong or it's false, but there are definitely some details that are a little bit off. Brian paid in cash. He showed up at their house with a suitcase loaded with cash. And you've got to think that this was a 6-figure transaction, but the family wanted cash only. Good for them. They were in the scrapbook. There were 500 items. Some of them were glued to pages. Most of them were glued to pages. But the baseball cards were mounted with photo corners, 4 photo corners. And I've got a picture here. I want to caution you that this is not actually a picture that includes the cards. These cards are fakes just to demonstrate what it looked like before the cards were taken out and authenticated. So I suspect Brian Durant had this done where he took a photocopy of the cards, cut it out, and then put them in the photo corners. The rest of the scrapbook, by my understanding, is this. This is the scrapbook. But those 33 Goudeys and 33 Sport Kings were graded and authenticated by PSA, and the autograph grades came out amazing. PSA believes that these were obtained through the mail, so TTM autographs, which is awesome, also right up my alley. I've actually sent out 4 or 5 cards this week through the mail. I haven't, since early winter, I haven't sent any out because of time restrictions, but this week I got started again, so I'm excited about that. There are a bunch of signed newspaper photographs that the collector had autographed, as well as the 4 cards. There's also a 1934 Butterfinger Premium with an auto grade of 10 on it. All of these are PSA authentic on the cards and newspaper articles with an autograph grades of 8, 9, or 10. This Butterfinger Premium was a 10. The Sport Kings Ruth autograph is the only Sport Kings Ruth autograph known to exist. It's the only one on the PSA Pop, and Brian Durant says it's the only one known to exist, and I believe it. It's pretty awesome. The Goudeys, there are about 20 or 25 that are on the PSA Pop report that are authenticated, with the autograph is authenticated. Blow Up Forums, like I said, is almost universally skeptical of this story. There were a handful of people who said, why can't we just enjoy good stories? And I agree with them. I want to just enjoy good stories, but there are a number of things here. So let's talk about how PSA authenticated the autographs. They said that the scrapbook paper was high in acid content, consistent with the 1930s. Makes sense. And that the acid content discolors paper from that time. The photo corners protected the cards corners. There was no discoloration on the corners, but the center of the cards were discolored a little bit. Showed a little toning, they call it. The toning process occurs over decades, and it is impossible, quote, impossible to manipulate in any fraudulent way, and it is not a process that can be replicated. That may be true, as far as we know, but like with the performance-enhancing drugs in sports, the cheaters are always ahead of science. And is it possible that the forged autographs are ahead of the manipulated aging or reproduction reproduced aging, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think right now. Manipulated aging is ahead of PSA. Is it possible that they don't know what people are doing? I think it's possible. I tend to believe that PSA vast majority of the time gets these things right, but we know that they get some things wrong. It's impossible not to. Drent said that the scrapbook was very rough, very old, in poor condition. There was almost no value to collectors whatsoever. He wasn't even sure he would try to sell it. The PSA blog, summarizing the 2019 National, said one of the Ruths had sold on the National floor for 6 figures. Brian Drent, he sold one of them. He actually talked about selling 3 of them privately, and one of them at auction in 2019. And I found that one. That is a 1933 Sport Kings PSA Authentic Autograph 9 that he sold for about $145,000 in 2019. In 2020, he sold another one. It was a 1933 Goudey. It was number 181, Ruth, PSA Authentic, autograph grade of 9, sold for $179,000 in late 2020. So I've got to think that that one was one of the ones that he sold privately in 2019, and then it came back to him in 2020 to resell. That's my assumption. But that is one of those things that blowout forums considered a red flag. The timeline didn't match up. All 4 of them, according to Brian Drent, sold for $564,000. So pretty impressive, pretty awesome deal. Holy grail for an autograph collector, for a TTM autograph collector. I love these stories. I love knowing the provenance of autographs and collectibles and things like that. This one did have quite a few different red flags of sorts. I tend to believe that the story is close to this, but there's definitely a couple things there that are suspect, that are questionable. I want to know what you think. Is this a real one? Is it not? I'll be back on Sunday with Clearing the Bases, where I cover all of the news of the week or 2, because I didn't do one last week, in Sports Card world. Click that subscribe button if you're new here. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you guys have a great weekend.